Sterling Hayes was a man who had it all: wealth, power, and an empire built from nothing. But when faced with a devastating diagnosis, he makes a choice that shocks everyone: to walk away from his fortune and seek a purpose he never thought he'd find. Leaving behind his luxurious life, Sterling finds himself in a forgotten town, where his legacy will be defined not by his riches, but by the impact he makes on those who have nothing. What drives a millionaire to give up everything? And what he discovers in this small town will change more than just his own life. It will transform an entire community. This story will move you, challenge you, and make you question what truly matters in life. Sterling Hayes stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his high-rise office, gazing at the city lights twinkling below like stars caught in a grid. From this height, he saw the world as a game board, where he was the master player, moving each piece with calculated precision. Every success, every acquisition, every deal made him feel invincible. But lately, there was a hollow ache in his chest that no victory seemed to fill, an emptiness that echoed louder than all his achievements. Sterling had built his empire from the ground up, transforming his inherited wealth into a financial powerhouse. He was known in every elite circle as the man who could bend the market to his will. Raised by a father whose motto was, "Life is a battlefield, win or be defeated," Sterling had never allowed himself to be anything but the winner. Relationships were nothing more than strategic moves. Love was a liability he couldn't afford. His wife Vanessa, a socialite with a penchant for power, shared his obsession with status but not his heart. Their marriage was more of a merger than a union, built on appearances and mutual gain. Sterling's children, Miles and Emma, had grown up surrounded by the finest things money could buy, but were distant from the one thing they truly needed: his affection. They viewed their father not as a man, but as a resource. Their rare conversations revolved around what they could gain from him: a new investment, another allowance. Sterling was a walking bank to them, and that realization gnawed at him more than he cared to admit. One cold autumn afternoon, after closing another high-stakes deal, Sterling felt an unfamiliar tightness in his chest. He dismissed it at first, a mere inconvenience, but the pain grew sharper, more insistent. When he finally stumbled into the hospital, his world was about to shatter in a way he never saw coming. The doctor's words landed like a hammer blow. Stage 4 cancer. Terminal. For the first time in his life, Sterling felt truly powerless. His wealth, his empire, everything he had built suddenly seemed meaningless. The doctor offered words of comfort about treatments that might buy him some time, but Sterling barely heard them. All he could think was how little time he truly had left. Back at his mansion, Vanessa's reaction was as icy as the marble floors she walked on. She asked practical questions about life insurance and assets, already calculating her future without him. Miles and Emma were unreachable, too busy with their own lives to care. Sterling's home, once a symbol of his success, now felt like a gilded cage, trapping him in his own loneliness. One sleepless night, as he wandered through the empty halls of his mansion, Sterling stumbled upon an old article he had once read about a forgotten town in the Midwest. A place where people lived with almost nothing. A town where poverty had stolen even the hope of better days. Without thinking, he opened his laptop and started researching. The more he saw, the more he felt a pull he couldn't explain. Images of weathered faces, broken homes, and children with eyes too wise for their age filled his screen. And in that moment, Sterling Hayes made a decision that would change the course of his life forever. Sterling left everything behind with the same cold efficiency that had once built his empire. There were no farewells to Vanessa, no letters to Miles or Emma. They wouldn't have understood anyway. Instead, he packed a small suitcase, withdrew a modest sum of money, and disappeared into the anonymity of Middle America. He found himself in Fremont, a town long forgotten by the rest of the world. The highway bypassed it decades ago, leaving behind crumbling buildings, rusted cars, and people trapped in a cycle of poverty. The contrast between his former life and what lay before him was staggering. Gone were the gleaming skyscrapers and marble floors. Now he was surrounded by peeling paint, broken windows, and the smell of desperation. The people of Fremont were as worn down as their town, their eyes shadowed with resignation. Sterling's arrival sparked murmurs and suspicion. Who was this stranger with his expensive watch and tailored coat? A politician? A scam artist? The rumors spread fast, but Sterling didn't bother to correct them. He wasn't there to explain himself. He wasn't even sure he understood what had brought him there. It wasn't long before Sterling encountered Ava Whitman, a woman who had seen too much hardship in her 35 years. She ran the local food bank, a threadbare operation barely holding on. Ava's eyes were sharp with intelligence but dulled by exhaustion. Her life had been a series of sacrifices, raising 2 children alone after her husband died in an industrial accident. She had learned long ago not to trust strangers offering help, but Sterling wasn't offering help. He was offering himself. He showed up one afternoon asking if there was any work to be done. Ava looked him over, her skepticism obvious. What could this man, who looked more like a CEO than a laborer, possibly know about their struggles? "I need someone to help unload supplies tomorrow," she said, testing his resolve. "I'll be there," Sterling replied, surprising even himself with his certainty. The next day, as the sun beat down on the dusty lot behind the food bank, Sterling worked side by side with locals who eyed him warily. His hands, once used to signing multi-million-dollar contracts, fumbled with heavy crates and unfamiliar tools. His body ached in ways it never had before, but there was something profoundly grounding about the labor. For the first time in years, Sterling felt the weight of something other than wealth on his shoulders. He felt the weight of real work, of doing something that mattered. Days turned into weeks. Sterling kept showing up, slowly earning the trust of Ava and the others. He learned the names of the families who relied on the food bank, heard their stories of loss, and saw firsthand how poverty suffocated hope. There was a simplicity in their lives, a rawness that Sterling found both humbling and terrifying. They weren't trying to conquer the world, they were just trying to survive another day. As Sterling became more involved in the town, Ava's guarded demeanor began to thaw. She still didn't fully trust him. Who could blame her? But she respected his consistency. He wasn't just passing through, he was staying, contributing. He asked for nothing in return and never spoke of his past life. Sterling's transformation was quiet, but it was happening. He began to realize that for all his wealth and power, he had never truly lived until now. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of repairs at a local school that had fallen into disrepair, Ava finally asked the question that had been gnawing at her for weeks. "Why are you here?" she asked, leaning against the hood of her beat-up truck as the sun set over the barren fields. "This isn't the kind of place someone like you just ends up." Sterling hesitated. He had spent so long running from the truth, from the reality of his own mortality, that he wasn't sure how to answer. The words felt heavy in his throat, the weight of his secret threatening to pull him under. "I'm dying," he said, the admission falling from his lips like a confession. "I have cancer. They told me I don't have long." Ava didn't flinch. She didn't offer platitudes or sympathy. She just watched him, her eyes full of a quiet understanding that came from having seen too much suffering in her own life. "And you came here to... what? Find redemption?" Sterling shook his head. "I didn't come for redemption. I don't deserve that. I came because I didn't want to die surrounded by people who saw me as nothing more than a bank account. I wanted to be somewhere real." Ava nodded slowly, as if piecing together a puzzle. She didn't say anything for a long time, and neither did Sterling. They sat there in the fading light, 2 people bound by their own brokenness, finding a strange solace in each other's company. As the weeks wore on, Sterling's illness began to make itself known. The pain that had once been manageable now gnawed at him with a ferocity that couldn't be ignored. He hid it as best he could, not wanting to appear weak or draw attention to himself. But Ava saw through his facade. She noticed the way he winced when lifting boxes, the way his hands trembled when he thought no one was looking. "You can't keep pushing yourself like this," she told him one evening as they sat on the porch of the food bank. "You're not going to win this fight." Sterling chuckled darkly. "I've spent my whole life winning. I don't know how to lose." "This isn't about winning or losing," Ava said softly. "It's about how you spend the time you have left." Her words cut through Sterling like a knife, but they also gave him clarity. He realized that in his quest to control everything, he had forgotten the most important truth. Time was not a currency he could manipulate. He had wasted so much of it chasing things that didn't matter, and now that his time was running out, he needed to make it count. One morning, after a particularly bad night of pain, Sterling made a decision. He called a meeting with Ava and a few of the town's leaders. They gathered in the cramped community center, where the walls were covered with peeling paint and old photographs from better days. "I've been thinking," Sterling began, his voice weaker than he liked. "This town, it needs more than just food. It needs hope. It needs something that can help the next generation rise above what we've been given." Ava raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What do you have in mind?" Sterling took a deep breath, ignoring the dull ache in his chest. "I want to build a real school, a place where kids can learn, dream, and build a future. Not just a rundown building with broken windows. A real school, with proper resources and teachers." The room fell silent. It was an audacious idea, one that seemed impossible given the town's dire circumstances. But there was something in Sterling's voice, in his conviction, that made them believe it was possible. For the first time in years, they saw a glimpse of what could be, a future brighter than their present. The construction of the school became Sterling's obsession, a beacon of light in his darkest days. The townspeople rallied behind him, inspired by his determination and the vision of a better future for their children. Sterling poured every ounce of his remaining strength into the project, organizing volunteers, securing materials, and even using the last of his personal funds to fill the gaps. As the weeks went by, Sterling's health declined rapidly. The relentless march of his illness could no longer be masked by his determination. His once sharp eyes were now sunken, and his movements were slow and labored. He would often pause to catch his breath, clutching his chest when the pain flared up, but he refused to let his failing body dictate his spirit. One afternoon, as the framework of the new school began to take shape, a violent storm rolled in without warning. Wind and rain lashed the small town, tearing at the fragile construction site. Sterling, ignoring the pain that gripped his chest like a vice, rushed to the scene. The roof they'd worked so hard to assemble was threatening to collapse under the force of the storm. Without a second thought, Sterling climbed up the rickety scaffolding, determined to hold it all together. Ava screamed at him to come down, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. But he didn't listen. He was a man on a mission, driven by a purpose greater than his own life. The storm raged on, and in a cruel twist of fate, as Sterling reached the top of the structure, a bolt of lightning illuminated the sky. At that exact moment, a sharp, searing pain shot through his chest, more intense than ever before. His vision blurred, and the world seemed to tilt on its axis. His hands lost their grip, and before he could cry out, Sterling fell, crashing to the muddy ground below. Everything went silent. The rain pounded the earth like a drumbeat, marking the end of an era. Ava was the first to reach him, her face a mask of horror and anguish. She cradled his head in her lap, her hands trembling as she tried to feel for a pulse. "Sterling, stay with me," she shouted, her voice cracking, but his eyes were unfocused, staring up at the stormy sky as if searching for something far beyond it. "Did we do it?" he whispered, his voice barely audible, each word a struggle. "Did we build the school?" Ava nodded, tears streaming down her face, mixing with the rain. "Yes, Sterling, we're almost there. It's happening because of you." A weak smile tugged at the corners of his mouth. "Good," he murmured. "Then I didn't waste it. I didn't waste my time." With those words, Sterling's eyes closed, and for a moment Ava thought he was gone. But then, with a last surge of strength, he opened them once more, reaching up to touch her face with a hand that was already turning cold. "Thank you," he said softly, "for letting me be more than I ever was." And then, just like that, the light faded from his eyes. The rain seemed to slow, as if the world itself was mourning the loss of this man who had found his purpose too late. The townspeople gathered around, their faces etched with grief and disbelief. They had come to see Sterling not as the wealthy stranger who arrived unannounced, but as one of their own, a man who had given everything to lift them out of the darkness. His final act of sacrifice struck a chord deep within them, and they knew they could not let his dream die. Ava stood up, her face set with a new resolve, and turned to the crowd. "We will finish what he started," she said. her voice strong despite the sorrow that threatened to break it. "This school will stand as a testament to Sterling Hayes, to the man who came here not to save us, but to find himself." The next morning, the storm had passed, leaving the town blanketed in a heavy stillness. Sterling's body was laid to rest in a simple ceremony, attended by everyone in Fremont. They stood in silence, heads bowed, not because he was rich or powerful, but because he had become one of them. He was no longer Sterling Hayes, the untouchable millionaire. He was Sterling, the man who gave his life so that their children could have a future. As they lowered his body into the ground, Ava placed a small hand-carved plaque on the grave, the words etched with love and sorrow. "He gave us hope when we had none. He found in us what he'd lost in himself." Miles and Emma arrived days later, summoned by the news of their father's death. They were strangers in this town, out of place in their tailored clothes and polished shoes. The look on their faces was not one of sorrow, but confusion. They stood at the edge of the crowd, watching as the community honored a man they barely recognized. "Why would he come here?" Emma whispered, her voice tight with disbelief. "He had everything. What could he possibly have found in this place?" Ava turned to them, her gaze steady and filled with a sadness they could not fathom. "He found what he'd been searching for his entire life," she said. "He found a reason to live." She handed them a small leather-bound journal, the pages filled with Sterling's thoughts during his time in Fremont. Miles and Emma opened it hesitantly, reading the words of a man they'd never truly known. He spoke of his fears, his regrets, his desire to leave a legacy that wasn't measured in wealth, but in love and purpose. For the first time, they saw their father not as the distant, powerful figure they'd grown up with, but as a man who was broken and lost, yet willing to give everything to find meaning before his time ran out. The words he had written were raw and painful, a confession to the world that he had wasted so much of his life chasing things that never mattered. The final entry in the journal read, "It's not the money we leave behind that defines us. It's the lives we touch, the hope we ignite in the hearts of others. If I can be remembered for that, then I will have truly lived." In the days following Sterling's death, a profound stillness settled over Fremont. The town seemed to hold its breath, as if unwilling to let go of the man who had come into their lives like a whirlwind and left an indelible mark. The school he had sacrificed everything for was nearly complete, its walls standing tall against the sky, a monument to the spirit he had awakened in each of them. Ava Whitman took the lead, rallying the townspeople to finish what Sterling had started. The grief that had settled in her chest didn't paralyze her. It fueled her resolve. The project that once seemed impossible now carried the weight of Sterling's legacy, and no one was willing to let his dream fade into a distant memory. Together, the community worked tirelessly, their hands guided by a shared purpose they hadn't known they were capable of. People who had once felt powerless now found strength in each other. They painted, they built, they planted gardens around the school, turning the once desolate space into a beacon of hope and opportunity. As they labored, stories of Sterling spread through the town like wildfire. The man who had come to Fremont not as a savior, but as a seeker of redemption, became a symbol of transformation. He had arrived as a stranger with nothing to gain, yet he had left them with everything they needed to believe in a better future. Ava found herself replaying their conversations, those late-night talks when he had let his guard down and allowed his vulnerability to show. She thought of the way he had looked at the school, not as bricks and mortar, but as the embodiment of a second chance, for himself, for the town, for every child who would walk through its doors. Sterling's journey from a life of empty wealth to one filled with genuine purpose became the town's own story, a tale they would pass down for generations. Miles and Emma, Sterling's children, stayed longer than they had planned, feeling out of place yet drawn to the community that had claimed their father as one of their own. They watched as people spoke of Sterling with a reverence they had never seen before. These strangers seemed to know a different man, a man who had faced his mortality with courage and humility, who had found a way to be more than the sum of his mistakes. As they stood in front of the nearly finished school, Ava handed them a letter that Sterling had written in his final days. It was addressed to his children, words that seemed to carry the weight of every regret and every hope he had ever harbored. "My dear Miles and Emma," it began, the ink smudged in places as if written through tears. I spent most of my life believing that success was about winning, about power and money and conquering every challenge. I was wrong. Real success is what you leave behind in the hearts of those you touch. I found more wealth in this little town, among these humble people, than I ever did in my entire empire. I hope someday you will understand that it's not too late to become who you're meant to be. Don't chase what I chased. Seek what I found here. Miles and Emma read the words in silence, their hearts breaking in ways they hadn't expected. They realized that their father, the man who had always seemed so distant and invincible, had found his humanity in the place they least expected. The walls that had always separated them from him were built from misunderstandings and missed moments, and now those walls were starting to crumble. "I wish we had known him like this," Emma whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "I wish we had been part of this version of his life." Ava placed a hand on her shoulder, a gentle gesture of solidarity. "He left a piece of himself here," she said softly. "In this town, in these people, in that school. You might not have known him like this before, but you can carry his legacy forward. It's never too late to be the people he wanted you to be." Miles nodded, a tear slipping down his cheek. For the first time in his life, he felt the weight of his father's expectations not as a burden, but as a guide to a different kind of life, one built on compassion, empathy, and the courage to make a difference. The day the school finally opened its doors, the entire town gathered to celebrate not just the building itself, but the spirit that had brought it to life. They named it Hayes Academy, in honor of the man who had come to them not as a savior, but as a man searching for salvation. Children ran through the halls, their laughter echoing off freshly painted walls, their eyes wide with dreams that now felt possible. Ava stood at the entrance, watching them with a bittersweet smile. She knew that Sterling's journey had ended, but his impact would ripple through this town long after the last stone was laid. Fremont was no longer just a forgotten place on the map. It had become a testament to the idea that one person's transformation could inspire many. The townspeople placed a commemorative plaque at the entrance of the school, engraved with Sterling's own words. "The true measure of wealth is not in what you have, but in what you give. It's in the lives you touch, the hope you ignite in others." Those words became a guiding light for Fremont, a reminder that even the most flawed among us could leave behind a legacy of light. Miles and Emma stayed through the ceremony, standing quietly as they watched the community that had embraced their father. They realized that they had a choice now, either return to their old lives, unchanged by what they'd seen, or honor their father's memory by carrying forward the lessons he had learned too late. As they looked out over the sea of faces, each one etched with gratitude and respect for the man Sterling had become, they knew they couldn't go back to who they used to be. They had to find their own way to make a difference, to build something lasting, just as he had. And so, the seeds Sterling Hayes had planted in the soil of that forgotten town began to grow, watered by the tears of those he had touched, tended by the hands of a community that had become his true family. His journey ended in Fremont, but the legacy he left behind was just beginning to bloom. In the weeks following the opening of Hayes Academy, life in Fremont began to change in ways that no one had anticipated. The school became more than just a place of learning. It was a sanctuary of hope, a beacon for families who had once felt trapped by their circumstances. Children who had never dreamed beyond the dusty streets of their small town now spoke of becoming doctors, engineers, and artists. They imagined futures where possibilities weren't just distant fantasies, but achievable goals. Ava watched the transformation of the town with a mix of pride and sorrow. She knew that none of this would have been possible without Sterling's sacrifice, his willingness to confront his own mortality and turn it into something meaningful. She often found herself standing by the plaque at the school's entrance, tracing the words he had left behind, feeling his presence in every smile that crossed the children's faces. Miles and Emma, inspired by the legacy of their father, made a decision that surprised even themselves. They chose to stay in Fremont for a while longer, investing their time and resources into expanding what Sterling had started. They funded scholarships for the brightest students, ensuring that the doors their father had opened would remain wide for future generations. Slowly but surely, they began to understand what their father had found in this forgotten town, a sense of purpose that had eluded him in his world of power and wealth. Emma, who had once scoffed at the idea of leaving her comfortable city life, now found joy in mentoring the children at Hayes Academy. She saw pieces of her father in their determination, their hunger to make a difference, and it filled her with a sense of pride she never thought she could feel for a man she'd barely known. Miles, too, discovered a new path for himself. He traded boardrooms and stock charts for community meetings and hands-on work, finding that the real value in life lay not in amassing wealth, but in building something that lasted. As time went on, the story of Sterling Hayes became legend in Fremont. His journey from a cold, calculating businessman to a man who gave his last breath to create hope for others was retold around campfires, in classrooms, and at family gatherings. He was no longer just the millionaire who had come to die in their town. He was the man who had taught them all that life's true riches were found in compassion, connection, and the courage to change. Ava and the townspeople decided to hold an annual celebration in Sterling's honor, a day where the community came together to volunteer, to give back, and to remember the man who had changed their lives forever. They called it Sterling Day, and on that day, people from all around the region would gather to share their stories of kindness, resilience, and the power of transformation. Years passed, and Fremont continued to grow, its once faded streets now lined with new homes, community gardens, and bustling markets. Hayes Academy stood tall and proud, its classrooms filled with eager students, each carrying forward Sterling's dream. The school had become a symbol, not just for Fremont but for surrounding towns, drawing attention and support from places far beyond what anyone could have imagined. One sunny afternoon, as the town prepared for another Sterling Day celebration, Ava walked through the halls of Hayes Academy, her heart swelling with the life that filled the school. She paused at the wall where a portrait of Sterling Hayes had been hung, surrounded by photographs of the community's achievements and the faces of children whose futures he had helped shape. As she looked at his image, Ava couldn't help but speak aloud, as if Sterling were standing right there beside her. "You did it, Sterling," she said softly, her voice cracking with emotion. "You gave us more than we ever thought possible. You gave us yourself." Miles and Emma were there too, now fully integrated into the fabric of the town that their father had come to love. They stood with Ava, looking at the portrait, each silently thanking the man who had taught them that the true measure of a life isn't in what you possess, but in what you leave behind. Before the crowd gathered for the evening's festivities, Ava made her way to the stage in the town square. As the townspeople quieted, she took a deep breath and began to speak. "Today, we celebrate the man who came to us not for glory, not for redemption, but for something far greater, a purpose that changed all of our lives," she said, her voice strong yet tender. Sterling Hayes wasn't just a benefactor. He was a friend, a father, a guide. He taught us that the greatest wealth we can ever have is found in what we give to others. This school, this community, and this day are his legacy. And we will carry it forward every day, in every act of kindness, in every dream that becomes a reality, because he believed in us. The crowd erupted in applause, a celebration not just of Sterling's life, but of the spirit he had left behind. They were no longer just a small town overshadowed by its hardships. They were a community bound by the love and lessons of a man who had once been lost, but had found his way home. As the evening sky filled with stars, Ava felt a deep sense of peace. She knew that Sterling's journey had ended in the physical sense, but his spirit was very much alive, in the laughter of the children, in the hands that built homes, and in the hearts that believed in something greater than themselves. And as the celebration carried on, she glanced up at the stars and whispered, "Thank you, Sterling, for finding your way to us, for teaching us that the most valuable thing we can leave behind is the hope we inspire in others." Miles and Emma stood side by side with Ava, looking up at the sky, a newfound sense of connection binding them not only to their father, but also to this community that had become a part of their family. They understood now that Sterling Hayes hadn't just left them a fortune, he had left them a legacy, a map to a life that truly mattered. As the music played and the people danced under the stars, Fremont knew that Sterling Hayes' story would never end. It would live on in every brick of Hayes Academy, in every life touched by its walls, and in the heart of every soul that learned to believe in the power of a second chance. And so, the man who once thought he had nothing left to give had given everything, turning his final days into a beginning for so many others. Thank you for staying with us until the end of this deeply moving story. Sterling Hayes' journey reminds us all that true wealth isn't measured by what we own, but by the lives we touch and the hope we leave behind. If this story touched your heart, let us know your thoughts in the comments. We would love to hear what moments impacted you the most. Don't forget to like this video, share it with your friends and family, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel, Driven by Stories, where we continue to bring you tales of life, love, and the transformative power of human connection. Let's keep spreading hope and inspiration, one story at a time. Thank you for being part of this journey. We'll see you in the next story.